and arts management. So with that, I'm just going to sit down and ask some questions to get started. The first one that I'd like to ask is that, one of the things that I think you notice immediately, is, as I go through the biographies, is that neither of you have had what I would consider sort of a linear career. It's not an obvious, kind of you join as an associate in an investment bank and then kind of move up the ranks. You've had, kind of varied careers to get to where you are. And I'm really wondering, sort of how should someone who's maybe interested in a career in kind of arts management or management and entertainment think about getting started? What's the kind of early paths on the kind of road to where you've ended up? So maybe I'll start with you, Dan, and then go to Jed.
Sure. Well, let me begin by saying that I think Jed and I both did exactly what the brochure for SOM said we're supposed to do, which is to come here and get an experience that allows us to develop management skills and perspective, and then to apply our passion and our interest to those skills to our interests and see where that leads. From my own view, I always struggled with an interest in administrative leadership and how organizations function and best practices around that on the one hand, and a great love for cultural institutions and a desire to find meaning in my professional work. And I spent time at SOM when I was here thinking about that, and I actually thought about working in a museum. And now, all these years later, I finally have, 31 years after I graduated. So it isn't ever over, really, until it's over. So for me, I think, and I would advise all of you in thinking about this, that the creative possibilities are really infinite. And though we tend to think of careers as somewhat linear things, particularly since recruiters will come and talk to you about that, and what it means to be a partner at Goldman Sachs or whatever it is that you're here to talk about, most careers don't unfold that way. And it is the journey that is so interesting and rewarding. And for me, I would say, in retrospect, looking back on the things I've done, I never in a million years would have contemplated that I would have done those things when I was sitting in your seat. But I was excited about the possibility of that, and at each turn in the road, there were just new opportunities. I paid attention to my passion, and I worked very hard to try to learn and do the job that was in front of me, and through that learning, new things came along. He has a better answer, I'm sure.
I think not. To me, when people ask me about sort of career development, career advice sorts of things, one of the things I often say, and I think it has applied to my own career, is that you should figure out what you're best at. You should figure out what makes you happiest. And you should figure out what kinds of places value one or ideally both of those things the most. In other words, if you're a people person and you're working at Cummins Engine, I don't mean to pick on them. One of my classmates went to work there. I'm going to guess that depending on what your job role is there, that maybe that's not necessarily when I say people person, meaning kind of performance oriented. And if you can operate at the intersection of those three things, what are you best at? What makes you happiest? And what is the job that you're thinking about doing, or the job that you're in? What does that require to be a star? That's a pretty good place to operate. And I think that that's sort of the heuristic that I've used as I've made the transitions from the different parts of my life. I think that my dream as a child, and really why I chose SOM, was to have access to the drama school because I wanted to produce on Broadway. And I achieved that, but I achieved that 25 years, as Dan was saying, 31 in his case, 25 years after I left SOM. I went and did advertising for 15 years, then I ran this trade association for 10. And that didn't make it less sweet or wonderful when I did it, but it also didn't make it okay, well, I've done that, now what happens? Do I stop, or do I keep evolving? And that's the fun. And I think that in that way, old people like us are like millennials, that you become very conscious of time in how many more years are we going to really work, and what do we want to do with that time, and how do we want to add value, and how do we want to interact with all these various opportunities. And that is the fun, I think, is figuring that out.
So maybe as kind of a little bit of a follow-up, how much of the path that you've taken do you think was really kind of planned, and you really had kind of some thoughts about what the next step was going to be? And how much was it just opportunities came along and you kind of recognized that they were a good fit? to your interests or perhaps to your abilities?
I have never known what the next thing was going to be until it happened. I mean, in a generic sense, you produce one show, you want to produce another show, okay, but I thought I was going to graduate here and go work for a Broadway producer, and Jane Morrison, who was the development director, sort of casually said one day, Ogilvy made their advertising. Have you ever thought about advertising? And I said, no. And she said, well, they're not coming to recruit, but they've invited, if they've asked me if I have 3 or 4 people that want to send down to meet with them in New York, and I think you might have fun doing that, so why don't you look into that? And I went and I was completely seduced, and did that, and I thought, I'll just do it for a year or 2, and then I'm going to go produce. And then suddenly I was at Ogilvy for 10 years, and I was in advertising for another 5 after that, and I kind of thought that was going to be it. That was what I was going to do. And then I found a way to get back into the theater world and get closer to producing, not producing, but closer to producing. And I thought, I'll just do that for a year or 2, then I'll produce, because that's really what I wanted to do. And suddenly it was 10 years. And then I thought, well, if I'm ever going to do this, I'm 108. It's time to start. And so I did that, and then I thought, well, okay, that's great. I'll just do this now. And I had some success, and it was great fun. And then I heard about the Bucks County Playhouse in Pennsylvania, which had closed, had gone into bankruptcy, and I thought, wow, that's such a famous, wonderful theater, and somebody should do something about that. And so I started going down there, and I ended up raising some money and renovating the Playhouse and reopening it and producing in New York and doing that. I thought, well, that's it. That's great. That's my life now, and I'll die when I'm 88 on stage in Bucks County. It'll be wonderful. Then Lincoln Center came along, totally unexpectedly, and that's been wonderful. And now we'll get to the next thing, whatever that's going to be. And so there was no plan.
I think what makes it interesting is really the combination of some kind of life plan and capacity to acknowledge your own passion and serendipity. That's exactly how it plays out. So for me, I was thinking about, I came to SOM explicitly because I really bought into this idea of getting a set of skills and capacities to do this sort of work across the spectrum of institutions. I was working in a performing arts center before I came to SOM. I was interested in art, and I didn't know what management consultants did. I had no idea. I'd never taken an economics class. I didn't know a lot about that side of the world, and I was very excited about what I learned here on that side of it. And I ended up going to work at Booz Allen because there was opportunity for me to do so. I thought it would be a really valuable learning experience. I thought I could do something meaningful there. I also knew it wasn't a career choice. It was a step for me. And it was the most valuable professional experience I ever had, I have to say. There's no question about it. It wasn't always easy, but it was extraordinary. And so I think that combination of thoughtful, incremental decisions that are built around some sensible narrative you construct in your own head, that it has to make some sense, there has to be some through line to where you're headed, but that life will just invite you to do things you may not anticipate. When I look at what our classmates have done from SOM, it's the same thing. That very few have said, I think I'm going to go work at Cummins Engine and just rise through the ranks and eventually have a really high-ranking job there and then retire. There's nothing wrong with that, but that isn't mostly what happens. So I think that combination of being open and available to opportunity when you see it and understanding how it relates to some larger picture is what makes it really interesting. And that's what good career planning is all about, that combination of flexibility with some sort of core set of objectives. You had that. That's why it worked for you so well.
I feel so much better now.
That's why I'm here.
So both of you, are Yale SOM alums, and I think one thing that's maybe hard for those of us who are kind of joined Yale more recently to kind of appreciate is just how different Yale SOM was in its early days. Now we're sort of right in, I'd say, the thick of it with the top tier MBA programs, but at that time Yale didn't even offer, I believe, an MBA. It was still an MPPH. MPPM, right? And so, clearly going to Yale SOM at that time was a different choice. What was it that attracted you to the school at such a kind of early stage in its career?
Well, we had classes outdoors. There was no roof on the building. There was no electricity. It was pretty raw. You kind of decide what courses you wanted every morning, and we all figured out. We'd sit in a group. For me, it was really very simple. I the alternative would have been to get an MFA in theater management, and Yale then, and I think arguably now still, has the best drama school in the country. And but I knew that wasn't going to be sufficient for what I wanted to do. I wanted to really learn how to be a business person, and as Dan was saying before, get a bunch of skills that could be applicable in many cases. And then the excitement, you know, it was very small. My class was 90, the charter class was 60. So there was this feeling of we were all figuring it out together. We would have, this was about the size of my class, you know, that would come to these weekly meetings that Clay Aldifer used to hold, where we would discuss community issues and decide things like, you know, were we going to have majors or grades or, you know, bizarre things that, and I thought, well, that'll be cool because that's only going to happen once there, you know, you only get one chance to at a new venture like that. So it was the combination of those two things, and it was great. I had a wonderful time.
Yeah, as I said before, I think what SOM offered really resonated with me. The core skills that we were going to develop here would be comparable to any other place we would go. The financial skills, the analytical skills, those kinds of things that all people who are conversant in business know something about, we were going to learn. But the place was much more flexible and creative in the way it thought about what human beings can do collectively in a learning environment. It was far less structured. There's no question, as Jed said, that was true. I came in '83 as the first year, and I felt that too. I really loved, there was a certain kind of entrepreneurial spirit to the place where people were going to make this up and figure it out. The diversity of the student body was extraordinary in terms of its experiences and its intellectual interests and its professional background. So there wasn't this very significant pressure that business schools sometimes can place on students that there's a right way actually to go through business school and this is what you're supposed to do and you need to touch these bases or you're not going to be successful. That was not the case at SOM in my day. I hope it's still not the case here, I don't know. But there was that sense, and the physical resources of the place were not so impressive, but everything else was. And that really resonated with me. There was also an explicit desire for SOM to be part of the university. So there were students from around the institution that were on our campus, and I took classes, as did Jed, elsewhere, and that was a good idea. That was part of what we were here to do. And so I had very high expectations for what I would get out of this experience, and they were really exceeded by it.
Right. So let's turn to really thinking about, you know, kind of the arts and arts management world. Maybe I'll start with you, Jed. I mean, you know, you actually started your career in advertising and spent quite a few years in advertising. What do you think is different about, you know, kind of management or the way organizations need to operate in sort of an arts management environment versus, you know, sort of a more traditional professional services firm?
I think that, I don't know if you guys teach it in OB this way anymore, but Vic Vroom had the, you know, decision-making styles from, I think, A1 to G2, and G2 was the most group-oriented consensus decision-making, and A1 was the most autocratic. And arts management, you know, we often say that arts managers have a huge responsibility and no authority. Because when you're working, so I'll illustrate. So I produced Driving Miss Daisy on Broadway with Vanessa Redgrave and James Earl Jones, both wonderful actors. Vanessa is very challenging to work with. She has a process that is very important to her, and that's how she gets the performance that she gets. So there were all sorts of things that came along with Vanessa in terms of expenses and things that made the financial part of this challenging. But we get into rehearsal, and if you know the story of Driving Miss Daisy, this older Southern woman, and the sort of climax of the story is she takes this trip with her African-American chauffeur, and they go from Atlanta to Mobile. And there's a dialogue section about the map, and they get lost, right? So, so she needs a map, of course. Well, fine, that's natural. A map costs, you know, a couple dollars. That's not a big deal. No, Vanessa needed an actual map from Atlanta to Mobile. Now, nobody in the audience would see where the map was, but okay, we can probably get a map from Atlanta to Mobile. No. Vanessa needed a map from Atlanta to Mobile that was vintage in 1955, which is when the trip was supposed to have been taken. So you begin by reasoning, which is to say, well, you know, Vanessa, the audience, you know, it doesn't matter. She knows that it's the wrong map if it's the wrong map. And so now you have to make a decision. Are you going to spend $3,000 on eBay or whatever it was to actually find this. Yeah. Now multiply that out by, Dan's curators who say, well, we have to have that Etruscan whatever it is, and it costs $23 million, never mind, $3,000. And there's no real right answer, actually. I mean, we can all agree it's a beautiful piece of art or it's a great map, but is it a fiscally smart thing to do? Is it not? Is it to the core mission? Is it not? And that's the management challenge, is balancing those two things. You've got to be, all institutions, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit, have to financially exist. But in the nonprofit sector, you get sucked into the mission in a very dramatic vortex way that, and look, Ogilvy Mather, I'm very passionate about that experience. I'm passionate about that agency. And they talk about mission all the time, but it's not quite the same thing.
Mm-hmm. So, Dan, you've had a little bit different background, and you spent quite a few years in college administration. I'd be interested in your thoughts on, comparing college administration, which actually sounds in some ways very similar to the lots of responsibility, no authority, to, kind of running a museum.
Right, well, faculty are nothing like Vanessa Redgrave.
No.
Just no comparison there. Well, I'm asked this question fairly often since about a year ago I made the switch from higher ed. And I would say there's a very significant difference within the nonprofit sector between leading an educational institution and leading, say, a cultural one like the Met. And it is, I really always thought of my role as a college president or as an administrator as really a political position, because you really have no authority. You have no authority. Your ability to get anything done is the capacity to engage people in sharing your vision and getting people lined up, all the different constituencies that make an institution like Yale what it is. There are students, there are faculty, there are alumni, there are parents, there are donors, there's the administration, there's the board. They all have a different view and they all own the place. They all believe the institution is here for our benefit, which makes it healthy. And so there's a very high premium on effective shared governance for a place like Yale to succeed, or Haverford or any other place. And I always felt acutely as a college administrator that the job is to hear those voices, to channel the best of those voices, to direct a vision, to help craft a vision that is shared widely, that really articulates a compelling future for the institution in a real competitive world. So you have to map that onto whatever the external environment really is. So it's a very political job in the very best sense of the word. And I spent most of my time thinking about, those guys I don't think they're following me here. I better go meet with them afterwards and find out why they weren't nodding their heads as much as these guys, because I think they're not really with us. And then there's the faculty, and what about this? And you're always worrying about all of those people in the way that effective political leaders must worry about all those voices. And as a leader of a cultural institution, admittedly, it is still a nonprofit organization, but it is more hierarchical. There is the Lincoln Center, for whatever Jed says about maps and Vanessa Redgrave, the curtain's going up on Friday. And there's going to be an audience in the place, and it better have, everything in place for that to happen. Whereas that's not always the same. I'm not suggesting that colleges and universities don't open their doors and have students arrive, but many of the kind of decision cycles that we live with in higher ed are very different, and they're more forgiving, at least the ones that are concerned with shared governance and that are consequential. The Met has to open our doors every day. We have to have an institution that is safe, that is functioning. We have exhibitions that each one costs millions of dollars to mount. They need to be done well. The works of art have to be protected, all of that. And so there are curatorial voices, which are in many ways like faculty. They're deeply committed to their work and to the works of art and to their contributions to the field. There are administrative voices. There are all these different voices to be concerned with, but it's a slightly more transactional and managerial focused entity. And I think the key to being successful in any of these organizations is to figure that out as quickly as you can. What is this ecosystem? Who are the stakeholders? Why are they important? To what extent does their voice matter here? How do I engage people so that they buy into this and feel good about coming to work? But at the same time, there is the enterprise around you that has to have a balanced budget and meet all those operational conditions. And I have found that the Met is quite different in that sense from a college or university.
I think also that, on the topic of the difference in leading organizations, I think the premium on the story you're telling is high in the cultural sector. I'm not saying that Lloyd Blankfein isn't an inspiring person at Goldman and doesn't have a vision that he can talk to the employees about. But I find, and I think, and Dan and I have talked about this a little bit, that you have to, you have your vision, you have to engage people, and you have to tell the story over and over and over again. It's like the creation myth. And I'm always surprised, that how often you have to keep telling it. People don't get it the first time or the second time or the third time, and you have to keep, if you believe in it, you have to keep telling it, and you have to keep looking for different ways to get to the same punchline and the same story. And leaders who can do that are going to be very successful, because now we have a shared community. We have this shared thing in common, this mission that we've all embraced together, and everybody sort of knows what they're doing.
But everybody has to, or at least many of the constituencies have to hear their voices in your narrative.
That's right.
For it to work.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's right. It can't be just your story. It has to become our story.
Right.
Right. So there's an interesting aspect to trying to gather the voices and yet direct them a little bit in the direction you'd like. So I think, one of the things that's, kind of interesting, I have typically studied, more things like film and television. Those have been transformed dramatically, I would say, over the last kind of 20 years. Do you think there's kind of similar types of transformations that have been happening in kind of arts, in live performances, that have really either already influenced the way that the organizations there are operating, or perhaps will change going forward the way they need to operate in order to continue to be kind of effective cultural institutions?
Oh, good, you answer that.
So I think there are two very fundamental dynamics that are in place that affect all cultural institutions. One is about access. Who has a right to be part of this entity? And the other is content. What is it that we're actually providing to people? And we live in a society that is increasingly caught up with certain aspects of culture and art that one might call are celebrity-focused or different from what they were historically. And so at the Met, when I think about this question, the first core mission issue for us is, who do we serve? What are we here for? Are we a bastion of the best of civilization's material legacy that is kept safe within this extraordinary facility, and for those who have the preparation and the capacity can come and look at it on our terms, which is what the museum was for a long time? Or is it something else that's more dynamic and open and available? And how do we make sure that people who are intimidated by that place feel comfortable to come to it? And what kind of experience do we want them to have, even if they're not so well prepared to know what they're looking at? And that has been a core mission around that at the Met in the last several years. We want to be an institution that's available to everyone who wishes to have an experience with works of art. We know what our fundamental mission is, and how do we make that available to people at many different levels, and that can be transformational for them. That involves a whole series of steps and changes that were not on the Met's agenda 10 or 20 years ago. And then, as a consequence of that, is the issue of content. What are we actually producing for people? How do we think about the kind of programs that we develop so that those audiences can have the transformational experience, while at the same time, we have a commitment to something far more long-standing than our market segmentation and serving the audience today and tomorrow or even next year. We represent something much more long-term, and therefore we have to hold those in balance. But I think the Met is changing, the art museum world is changing more dramatically in the last few years than ever since I've been thinking about it all these years.
I would point to technology. And in the case of live performing arts, it's really the impact. There is a technological impact about how we present the shows and the stories, but the bigger impact is the expectations that have been created by technology, and that if you are a digital native, I define that as anybody who's under 40. You've never really lived in a world that didn't have a digital aspect to it. Your expectations for what's going to attract you to coming to a concert, or what's going to happen while you're at a concert, are very different than if you're 70 years old or 80 years old or even 60 or 50 years old. And we have to take that into account. If as live arts presenters, we just sit and say, well, if you can't bother to learn how to appreciate Beethoven, then I don't really care whether you come. which I think a lot of people think that's right. If you're really serious about it. Think about it, it was only 20 years ago that opera companies started putting the translations, because the idea was, well, if you really care about hearing the story, you'll read it. You'll read the translation. You'll understand what's going on. Or maybe you'll learn Italian in order to come to the opera. Well, that does not work if you're 22 years old. What's that? Not PayPal. What's the thing that delivers, like this afternoon? Starts with a P. P-PAC? Anyway, whatever. If it doesn't arrive, P-PAC, thank you. If it doesn't arrive, in 4 hours, then there's something wrong, right? So now how do we, on the other hand, there is something to be learned by actually thinking about Beethoven for a little bit before you listen to him. We'll get more out of it. So you want that to happen too. You want that to be part of the experience too. So how do you manage those two things? So I think digital is huge. And for Lincoln Center now, in building a new concert hall, which it's planning to do starting in 2019, what is that? How are people going to listen to music in 50 years? There'll be a chip in our heads, touch your nose or your forehead, and it'll play. So what does that mean for people gathering in a place to listen to music, and how do you figure that out?
So good point. I think one of the questions from the audience actually is a nice follow-up to this. And Dan, you mentioned access, and you were sort of just talking about digital technology and access in one sense, which you could think about the accessibility of the art or music itself. But the question is really, what programs and to what extent do you think digital access might allow you to expand access to the arts, right? Presumably by not necessarily having to have people come visit the Met physically or come to a live performance at the Lincoln Center.
I think I'm very bullish about digital distribution of content, because I'm fundamentally a live performance person, and I know that it's better. So I'm not afraid that if you experience it first, and I can hook you in and use the power of digital to do that, that you won't be more likely, you still may not come, but you'll be more likely to come than if I didn't try. Anybody who is a baseball fan knows that it's better to be in the ballpark. And you can see, watch baseball games in every way imaginable, on screens the size of my finger, on computers, on televisions, whatever it is. But there is no digital equivalent of walking through the tunnel and seeing the green field and watching a baseball game, if you're a baseball fan. So I would say the same thing about being a music fan or a ballet fan or an opera fan. I'm confident that those experiences are so thrilling that you will get the difference. But I got to get you interested enough to appreciate the difference. And that's where digital is my friend, not my enemy.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And in fact, digital is inevitable. So any other point of view is likely to be doomed. In an art museum 20 years ago, there would have been, or even at a university, a discussion around digital technologies are really, they're not adequate to do justice to the kind of experience of works of art that museums represent. And therefore, digital technologies should be seen as really marginal things. And that's no longer true. The capacity of digital technology to engage people really meaningfully with works of art, it's not exactly the same. I think Jed's exactly right. There's nothing like being in front of a work of art directly to have that experience of the work of art, but it ain't bad to see it on a really good digital platform as well. So several years ago, we made a significant investment in our website with the idea that the digital platform can really complement everything else we do in very meaningful ways and enrich the learning experience for people around the world. We have more than 35 million visits to our website a year, and many of those are people who will never come to the museum, never. But they have, and the countries that are well represented are ones you might not expect. One of the most frequent populations that visit our website are from Iran. And they love our museum. I don't know why that is the case, but it's an extraordinary number of people. And there's a tremendous amount of content that's put there that serves especially well what digital platforms can do. Video content and interviews and all kinds of ways of seeing and connecting the image itself to a historical context in ways that's really supplemental. So I think if we understand it's not a poor substitute or a compromise, but rather a complement to what we're doing, then we now think of the Met as having 4 major platforms. We have 3 buildings plus the website. And increasingly, the website will be a place that we can deliver content to people around the world that because of who we are and because of the collections and scholarship and mission that we advance, we are especially well positioned to do. So it's not threatening us. It's not likely to shut the place down, or as Jed said, people are still going to show up. But that's new. That's happening very, very quickly. The challenge is it's moving so quickly, and it's so powerful and so central in all of our lives. What are the right decisions? What are the right investments? Because we're almost always wrong about them. And so what do we do about that?
I think it's also, it gets to an interesting question for cultural institutions, and maybe this is a fundamental difference. What is success? Like, what should we be counting? Historically, you count the number of people who show up. Audiences, or how many people, visitors the museum gets, whatever it might be. I don't think that's right. I think it's more something like, how many people do we touch? How many people do we engage with over all platforms, live, digital, and otherwise? How many schools are we in? How many communities are experiencing Lincoln Center work? How many people are on the plaza, that beautiful plaza in the middle of central Manhattan, experiencing Lincoln Center? And and shouldn't we be counting all those people? And I think that's going to direct, because as people, funders and board members, et cetera, evaluate these institutions, they need to be retrained, that it's not just about, because for some of these things, like mostly Mozart, been going on at Lincoln Center 50 years, will be the 50th anniversary this summer, it sells like 92% of capacity. Not very interesting. I mean, it's wonderful, that's great, but I mean, living around for 20 years to get it to 93% is not a very interesting objective. Now, how could I share mostly Mozart with 1 million people? Maybe if it had its own Sirius channel just for those 2 weeks. Maybe if the Mostly Mozart Orchestra went on tour. Maybe. Now that gets more interesting. So you still want the 92% of capacity to get filled, but the impact gets broader, and that's what we should be keeping track of, I think.
And it may seem obvious, but it actually isn't when you sit in these seats. What actually is the mission of the place? What's the job? And some people would say the job is to get to 94% because we really need that marginal revenue in order to be able to whatever. Right. And so helping to figure out the core question is really a big part of what these jobs are all about.
So maybe as a follow-up, I mean, both of these I think are kind of interesting ways of thinking about how technology might change the world of arts management. Does this also mean that we're going to need to start thinking about different business models for delivery as well?
Yeah, well, one of the great challenges that many organizations face around technology is whether or not it's appropriate to monetize that technology in ways that advances mission. We've struggled with that at the Met. We feel very strongly as an educational institution with a scholarly mission. And as Jed said, we take a look at how many people are visiting our website, where they come from, what are they doing with that website, and how is that ultimately helping the world and helping us do our job over the long term. It's not obvious that turns into revenues in a way that's consistent with those objectives. So we've talked a lot about that. And I think one of the great challenges which we can talk about in this room, if you're interested, is how do you lead a cultural institution, and this is true for most of them, where revenues are going to grow at a rate lower than costs. That's axiomatic. It's just the state of this. It's like universities, too. How do you do that? And so we're always thinking about ways in which we can optimize revenue in order to be able to do more. But where do you draw the line? And for us, technology is an area where we have made no decision to do that at this stage because we don't want to undermine those things that we think are really valuable. And the idea that there are legions of young people who are deeply interested in art, they don't even have to be young, who are impoverished and don't have resources, but have access to a computer and can have a very rich experience at the Met. We do not want to make that harder for them. That isn't who we are. So we haven't used technology in that way thus far. We have other creative ideas about revenue, but that isn't one of them.
This was picking up on this, what Dan's saying. This was a huge thing that I was confronted with in the first few months. So we were doing a production of the St. Matthew Passion, which Berlin Philharmonic, so that's 100 and some musicians and a gigantic cast and a choir and building a theater inside the Armory in New York. 2 performances, $6.5 million for 2 nights. So, and it seated, I can't remember, I'm going to say 500 people, let's say. So there was no question we were going to sell 1,000 tickets. And there was also no question we probably could have sold them at $500 a ticket or $1,000 a ticket, because there will be 1,000 people in this world who can afford and who are interested in the St. Matthew Passion to come and see it. And it was spectacular. And the reason to want to present it at all is because that's certainly part of the core mission, is to be the presenter of last resort. Nobody else could afford to spend $6 million on 2 performances. This great achievement, Peter Sellers directed, Berlin Philharmonic. On the other hand, $6 million and 1,000 people, let's forget about who the 1,000 people are for a second. Well, that doesn't seem like a really great use of resources. And then $6 million and 1,000 really rich people? Well, I don't know about that, because there's also, to Dan's point, there's a part of the core mission. So what do? Do you not present it at all? Well, that seems foolish, because it's a great piece of art. But then, if you present it and don't charge any money? I had this weird realization the other day that the Metropolitan Opera, my friend Peter Gelb, who runs the Metropolitan Opera, I'll be way wrong, but just go with me, conceptually. He's got a $300 million plus annual operating budget. He gets about $75 million in ticket sales, and he raises the rest of the money in other miscellaneous things, right? $75 million. Well, you go to one donor, one hedge fund guy, and say, $75 million, you can offer the opera for free for a year. 4,000 seats a night, 8 nights a week, 50 or 40 weeks a year. Opera could be free. And then you don't have to have a development department, forgive me. And you don't have to aggravate about all these things. One check, one person. Well, is that right? I don't know if that's right. And if you offer it for free, by the way, does that mean people don't value it anymore? And then is that bad for the long term? Now, most of us are not presented with that decision to make, but we're presented with gradients of that decision every single day. What do you charge for St. Matthew's Passion? And who's going to come and see it? And how do you share it?
Right, that's a question mission-driven institutions face all the time. You might ask, for example, maybe Yale should be free, given its resources, and then the place can just be available to anybody. Well, it is almost in the sense that its financial aid is given on the basis of availability to pay. So that's the compromise that institutions like Yale can afford to make, because they have those resources. But we're always asking that question, because our primary objective is not optimizing profitability and shareholder value. It's something else. That's why our cost structures always grow at rates in excess of our revenues. And if you go into this sort of work, that's what you will think about all the time. There's a fundamental existential question.
So I think that's an interesting lead into, this is the Leaders Forum, and we've already been talking a little bit about leadership. But what do you think are some of the most important qualities for being a leader in, say, arts management or entertainment space? And do those differ in any ways from just the qualities of a good leader for any organization in another sector?
I've had the opportunity to, as a management consultant, work with leaders in industry across a whole spectrum of different industries. I don't think the skill set is all that different. The knowledge base is certainly different. It's good to know the vocabulary and those kinds of things of any particular sector in which you work. But for me, I think successful leaders have a certain set of transferable or consistent skills that allow them to be successful, whether they're running Pepsi-Cola or Lincoln Center or any place. And for me, those are, first and foremost, the ability to identify and support really strong people. In these jobs, we actually don't do very much except support people who do a lot. And if we don't have teams of people who are capable and focused and rewarded, it's very hard to leverage your own skills. It's not. So for me, that's a fundamental skill set. And the constant support and nurturing of those people in ways that's consistent with what you expect of them. Ask a lot of them, but also make sure that you're giving them that latitude. People get that wrong all the time. And there's that. For me, and I'll do this quickly, being an active and energetic learner and listener is fundamental to being successful in any place you work, even if it's an industry you know. There's this whole dynamic around feedback and the ability to adapt and learn all the time that leaders have every reason in the world to insulate themselves from through all kinds of approbation and success, and I see that all the time. Like, they just think they're as funny as everybody's laughing at them all the time, and they're just not. So being attentive to what's going on around you and listening very carefully so that you can learn that environment all the time. For people who love to learn and really enjoy that kind of challenge, these sort of positions are extremely, extremely valuable. And then finally, I'll just mention one other. That is, there is an overwhelming number of pressures on our schedule and our attention all the time, every day. And the ability to discern what's important from what's not important, to ask yourself, why am I going to those 7 meetings today, and will the world be a different place, or even the Met be a different place because I'm doing those? Is that the best use of my time? What really matters at the end of the week or at the end of the year? And I think people miss that. It's so easy to be taken up in the sweep of day-to-day events and everybody who wants your time and attention. But that is a finite resource, and thinking really carefully and proactively about where that time and attention should be devoted in order to make a difference, I think is crucial. And again, those all may seem obvious, but I've seen example after example of people who, in my view, don't get it and they don't succeed.
I think passion about the work and passion about ideas. I suppose great leaders, if you're a great leader, in theory, you can lead any group or any organization. But I have always made it a point, you know, I didn't get the job at Lincoln Center because I was the guy who knew the most about opera or classical music. But I sure as heck tried to make sure every day that the people who did know the most about those things knew how passionate I was about what they did and passionate I was about learning from them. And I think that always stands you in good stead. I mean, the fact of, you know, return to my friend Vanessa Redgrave, you know, we went and found the map, right? And bought it, which sent the message that we care about your process. You know, that's not how I would have played the scene, but I'm not an actor. If I could act, I'd do that for a living. You, Vanessa, know the best about how to play that scene. If this is what you need, it's my job to support you. And that, with artists or with curators or with presenters or directors or composers, that's everything. Everything.
So I think there's a couple of interesting questions from the audience that are perhaps somewhat even related. One person was asking about how you sort of prioritize or manage the interests of different stakeholders who may have, you know, competing interests. And a question that just recently came in was also sort of advice on managing boards, which we might think of as, you know, sort of one of the very important stakeholders. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. I think Dan is much better at this than I am. I think I've been on a learning curve for this, and that's terrific. I think it's a very hard thing to do because I remember one of my mentors saying to me in kind of mid-career, you know, the best idea doesn't always win. What do you mean? Mom and Dad told me all I had to do was study the hardest and be the smartest, and then we'd win. Well, it doesn't work like that. You got to be smartest, but you also have to, as Dan said, you know, build consensus. You have to do any number of things to make these ideas come to life. And so I default too often to, but this is such a great idea. You know, what do you mean? You don't want to, you know, do St. Matthew's Passion with the thing on the, you know, on the barge and the wherever it is. And I just default to don't, you know, and I can talk for hours about how brilliant it is, you know, instead of listening. As the sage said, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, and you should use them proportionally. And it is really true. Try to figure out, so why is that board person not embracing this obviously brilliant idea? And then figure out how to package that idea so that they do embrace it. And it takes time, and I get impatient. And so thank you for this hour of therapy. I feel much better.
I think this may be something of a paradox, but actually these leadership roles, we work for the board, but part of our role as a leader is to help to guide the board, give them counsel and a set of expectations around, if you want me to be successful in this job, how I need to work with you and what I need from you. And that needs to resonate with what they expect of themselves and what it actually says in the guidelines. And so many board members at a place like the Met, it's full of, and Lincoln Center, it's full of people who do serve on boards all the time, who have enormous experience in them. Nonetheless, it varies from institution to institution, and there is a local culture, and most board members want to fit into that culture. So it is the leader's job to help shape that culture and define what its core values are. And so I talk about shared governance a lot because I grew up in higher education and found that to be valuable. It's extremely important to have a strong relationship with the board, that they understand their job and they understand your job and how you're accountable to them for performing that job. And there's a very big difference between leading an institution and setting a strategy and developing a vision and providing the oversight over that a board does. And many organizations lose their way when they have members of the board, and it could be a small number of them or even one, who don't get that. They have a different view about what their role is. So board culture has to be carefully developed over time so that when people are brought into the organization in that role, they understand that role. And at the Met, for example, which I think does this exceptionally well, there are lots of people you could imagine on the board of the Met who aren't, because they actually wouldn't fit into that system well at all. And I'm surrounded by people enormously successful who almost to a person understand my job and their job. And they're totally available, they're extremely supportive, they're very smart, they ask good questions, and then they defer. What's the vision for the institution? Where do you want to go with this? How do you think about this question? So I put it out there, and they test and they challenge and they support. I have been in organizations where that's not the case. So board governance, the most important component to being successful in these jobs is having that relationship with the board. And sometimes the hand you're dealt is just not workable. That sometimes you need to see it and get it, and that's the way it's going to be. But it's impossible to be successful in these positions if you don't have a board that understands and shares the vision for what the role is and how they can be supportive to you. And again, it varies by institution quite a lot. So I think that's a crucial component of being successful. And it's incumbent on you to lead them, even though that's not obvious. It's important.
So we're talking about the board almost as though it's an entity, but clearly the board is actually a group of people. How much of this is really, you're interacting one-on-one in different, kind of individual conversations, and how much of it is really, that you're coming together as a group and having a discussion, all together about these issues?
I think many of these, one of the reasons these jobs are hard is that they are incredibly labor intensive, and the board is a good example of that. The job is you need to customize the experience of the institution for each and every board member. Now, Lincoln Center has 65 or 68 board members. He's got a ton of board members. That's a lot of people, and it's a lot of people who each of whom has a different reason for wanting to get involved, a different personality, a different tugs on their time, on their lives, what makes them tick, et cetera, and putting in the time to actually learn that and get to know that, and to be able to deliver the experience of the organization. And I think the really great leaders that's one of the things that makes them great, is that they just understand each individual on the board, that it's not just, as you say, one big entity.
Those relationships are really important. If there is a basis of trust and respect and affection, it'll carry you a long way in difficult moments, and if there isn't, it won't. Our board, between elective trustees, honorary trustees, and emeritus trustees, is like 95 people. There is no way I can maintain a kind of level of relationship with each of those people that I would like. But it is valuable to segment that market and to identify who are those people that are the most influential, who have the most to teach us, who have the most important roles within the board. Those relationships especially must be nurtured all the time. And if they are, then these jobs become less lonely, because these are people who are there for you and with you and available all the time. And so, again, thinking smart about that. The board is a big entity, but it consists of individuals, and there are 16 of those people that are whatever, that I need to work with very closely all the time for these reasons, and they can help me and teach me and support me, and we'll be right there. And the rest of them, there's a group dynamic as well. If they see that the most influential members of the board are completely present and supportive, they'll also join in, because not everybody on the board is equally involved. That's also just how boards are. So getting a good read on your board and who those relationships ought to be developed with is very important.
So both of you have talked about the importance of a team and really working with other people within the organization, or perhaps even that are affiliated with the organization, say through the boards. What do you think are the most important aspects of putting together a really great team? How much of it is sort of selecting the right people, and how much is it, given the set of people that you have, having the right sort of processes in place and managing that well?
I think that performing arts certainly is collaborative by nature. If you want to work by yourself, go write a novel and sit on a mountain somewhere, and then you're still going to have an editor, I suppose. But so I think there is a sort of team orientation. One of the things that's hard about big institutions, big cultural institutions, is that everybody gets very comfortable. And so if you want to move teammates around, and I don't even mean necessarily let people go and replace them, I just mean just change the deck chairs sometimes. Sometimes institutionally that's very hard to do, and people get very nervous about that, and what's the impact on the mission, et cetera, et cetera. But it is certainly a team culture. There used to be something, I'm sure it's, well, I know it's not true at IBM anymore, because I worked on that business when Lou Gerstner first came in, but prior to Lou, there was this culture of, it was called non-concur. And in the culture of non-concur, you'd have all the people in a room who were related to a project, and you could have 20 people or 30, whatever it is. If one person said, I'm not comfortable, or I have a question, or whatever, the project didn't go forward. Well, gee, what a surprise. Not a lot of projects went forward because there was a lot of non-concurring going on. And I think that at big institutions and cultural institutions, there is some of that, which is, well, you have to have 20 people in the room to decide what the cover of the brochure is going to be like for Mostly Mozart. Well, at a certain point, I'd like the most artistic person to be in the room. That would be good. And after that, I don't care a whole lot because that's the person who really knows. So let's have that person there. That's hard for, at least I have found it hard in cultural institutions.
I think it's really important to set out what the agenda for a team is, what's on the table to be discussed, and how can a collective process make a better decision, and what isn't. There are certain things that ought to just be dispatched. Let the artistic director figure out what the brochure ought to look like, and let's stay out of it. For me, it's two things to make a team work well. One is making sure you have people in the room who are participating in this work that are comfortable with the dynamic you're seeking. I have seen again and again really successful, effective people. When there's a leadership change, they leave because the dynamic isn't right. It needs to be right. There has to be good chemistry. That's one. The other is for a team to be successful, and this is one of the greatest challenges I always face, people have to be completely comfortable disagreeing with each other, including me or anybody else in the room. And it takes a while to build that trust where it's okay to say, Dan, I heard that idea. It's a terrible idea. We can't do that, and here's why. And really just mix it up. It takes a long time to build that. But once you have that, you have people of great talent who are committed to the institution that you can work well with, who are willing to challenge each other in a productive and healthy way. You're going to make much better decisions. And if you do that, you don't actually have to be all that smart to run the place because the best ideas will come out of what is a really synergistic process. Naturally, building that kind of team dynamic is a crucial element to being successful. It's not always easy. In my experience, it can be one person in the room who's just not going to play ball. They don't like it. They're going to, they're just not engaging. So building that chemistry, it takes time, and you have to really cultivate each person and change individuals. But once you have that, if they're comfortable really throwing it in with you, and you're comfortable being wrong, leaders are wrong all the time. It's not being wrong. It's acknowledging you're wrong and moving on. If you're open to that, you're just going to do a better job, and you're not going to get yourself into trouble. So for me, that's what makes teams successful, and we work at it every day.
So I think one of the things that both of you have mentioned at different points is that these are really mission-driven organizations, and I'd be curious as to both your thoughts on kind of what the mission is, and also I guess somewhat embedded in that is what do you think the value of art or music to society is?
It's an easy one. You want to go?
Yeah, that's not a problem.
I build up to the easier questions.
The way I conceived of the mission at Lincoln Center was great art for all. We always should be striving for the greatest, highest level of presentation and performance, and it should be accessible to everybody at all times in every way imaginable. And that's what I tried to preach over and over again while I was there. I will, in terms of the second part of the question about the value of art and culture, it's fundamentally what makes us human, and I defy anybody. I mean, know the reality. There are lots of people who think it's unimportant, but I defy anybody to really try to live a life that way, because it's an empty life. And whether it's visual art, whether it's so-called high performance art, whether it's low performance art, it's a better world if that's in your life. And I've seen it. I had an extraordinary experience. I'll tell this very quickly, and then I'll be quiet. I went into one of the Lincoln Center schools where we do school programs, and the Lincoln Center take on this is not to duplicate what Juilliard, one of our constituents, do in terms of teaching everybody to be the greatest performers, but it's to integrate the teaching of art and culture in the context of everything else you're learning, math and social studies and history and science, et cetera, et cetera. And I went into this classroom, this 5th grade classroom, a public elementary school in New York, and watched one of our teaching artists teach. And the project for the day was they were making, you had to create a creature, like a sort of arts and crafts project. And then there was a discussion about what did your creature eat, and when did it live, and how did it move, and all those sorts of things that you can imagine. And I watched these children be engaged, 30 kids, be mesmerized by this hour conversation with this teaching artist, who happened to be a visual artist, by the way, not a history professor or an anthropologist. And what became so clear was that this was a lesson not about this creature or not about archaeology. It was a lesson about using your imagination. Now, why is it important to use your imagination? It's important to use your imagination because if you have an imagination, you can imagine a life circumstance other than the one that you're in. And for so many kids, if they don't have that, they have nothing, because they have no motivation to make it different. And art and culture teaches you to use your imagination. And that's why it's so fundamental. And that's why access to art is a right, it's not a privilege. And that's why we have to fight for that in every damn school system in this country. And we have to fight for it in every community in this country, because it's going to make more holistic people, which can't be a bad thing for this troubled world we're in. And if you vote for me, I promise you.
Well, I never should have let you go first.
Exactly.
I would only add, I think that's exactly right, and that the ways in which people connect with art, myriad ways in which people connect with art, enriches their lives and increases their humanity, and that ultimately it's a civilizing and humanizing process. Steven Pinker wrote about the 20th century as the most safest century in the history of civilization, which is somewhat counterintuitive given the fact that it has been filled with wars. But he argues quite compellingly that the human condition has evolved in ways that is safer and less violent because of a variety of things: empathy, the capacity to understand others. And art is a great way, whether it's through performing arts, music, or the fine arts, to open up people's perspectives and ideas about what the world is really like. It enhances imagination, but it also increases empathy, and that ultimately will be the saving of our civilization.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a fantastic place to pause the conversation, but thank you for joining us this afternoon. I hope that everyone's enjoyed it, and I'd like to give you a round of applause for